1200 years ago, somewhere deep in the mystical land of Cathay, a mad chemist decided to combine charcoal, sulfur, and niter, believing he would create a wholesome medicine. Instead of curing the ills of mankind, his experiment would doom hundreds of millions to incendiary pain and death. He had invented black powder. When kissed by a flame, given just a peck, the powder would ignite and burn rapidly, and when confined inside of a container, the trapped gases would make it go boom. Initially, this strange concoction was used in creating outstanding shows of light, but the military application must have been obvious from the almost get-go. This would lead to the development of the firearms talked about in previous episodes: the musket, pistol, and blunderbuss. But the first gunpowder weapon was much more rudimentary. Gunpowder packed inside of a pot, lit on fire, and thrown to explode. They soon evolved into a swelling, horrible family of incendiary and explosive weapons, ranging from landmines to grenades and fire wheels, collectively called fireworks. Gunpowder itself is dangerous, even just the production of it. It was just as disgusting. Niter, commonly called saltpeter, is a substance hard to come by. It was mined in places like China and India, from whence it was imported by the Europeans. Naturally, this would be very expensive, especially when gunpowder became essential for the waging of war. Enemy pirates could disturb the vital shipments of niter. So an equally deranged fellow soon discovered that the soil in which animals urinated and defecated had a similar taste to niter. This is not a joke. Manuals from the period recommended that the chemist taste some of the soil. Put some on the tongue. If it stings and is found to be a little salty, it is a sign that it contains some niter. This dirt was then processed in copper pans until only the purest white saltpeter remained. This salty substance was then combined with sulfur and the charcoal from willow trees. Different amounts of each substance produced different types of gunpowder. 6 parts saltpeter, 1 part sulfur, and 1 part charcoal made serpentine, a fine-grained powder that burned very quickly and was used for priming. Common powder had 4 parts saltpeter, 1 part sulfur, and 1 part charcoal, so on and so on. Saltpeter produced the explosion, sulfur caught fire, and charcoal married them into one. These ingredients were then ground up together and mixed with water in large vats, creating a dark and repulsive substance. This was then dried up into cakes and ground up in mortars to produce the fine serpentine. Be careful, just a single spark and boom. To produce powder with larger grains, used as the main charge in firearms, the cakes were put between pieces of parchment, cut with holes the size of the desired corns. The parchments were then grounded between bits of wood, and there you had gunpowder. The substance itself was dangerous. In the late Middle Ages, it was believed that gunpowder and its bullets were poisonous, and that wounds had to be specially treated. This was disproven in the 16th century, but this highly flammable powder was still able to scorch and burn. Accidents were common. In 1681, pirate explorer Lionel Wafer was wounded in a gunpowder accident. Another pirate was drying his powder on a silver plate. Somehow the powder ignited, tearing away the flesh of the man's knee so that the bone became visible, and burning deep into Lionel's thigh. Another horrible accident was described by Alonso Ramírez, held captive by one of Lionel's friends, William Dampier. A 10-pound ball and powder cartridge I was carrying exploded in my hand by accident, burning it, some of my thigh, part of my chest, and my entire face, stripping the hair from my head. I was cured with a white unguent found in the medicine chest. Because of the dangers posed by gunpowder, especially aboard of a wooden ship, they had to be stored in an especially cautious manner. The powder was kept inside of budge barrels, fastened with a leather purse at the end to keep the powder safe from fire. The barrels were stored in a special compartment aboard the ship, the powder room or magazine. It was either situated in the fore or after part of the ship's hold, and built to be fireproof. No person was allowed inside with a light. Instead, lighting was supplied by the light room, a small compartment adjacent to the magazine and connected by a fireproof window, where you could keep the lights. This would allow the gunner and his assistants in the magazine to fill cartridges with powder. Smaller ships and merchantmen might not have a light room. Instead, they would carry a small lamp, called a lampion. Fire regulations were strict aboard a ship, especially so inside of the magazine. No pipe smoking, no walking around with steel-capped shoes, and no burning of brandy. However, the powder was fickle and could be made of poor quality. Some manufacturers were more decided than others. Tower-proofed powder, made in association with the Tower of London, was regarded as top shelf. Spanish colonial powder was often seen as bad. Gunners frequently had to test the quality of their powder by burning it on a piece of paper. The less of a remnant the burned powder left, the better it was. It could also turn bad. Every 3 weeks, the gunner had to turn all of the budge barrels and cartridges upside down, allowing the saltpeter to descend and disperse into the powder. It was said that the best powder wasn't black, but had a russet or azure sort of color. If the powder was damaged by moisture, it would turn into black mud. It had to be dried and grounded up into corns again. Some people view the grenade as a very modern weapon, but it is the most ancient and rudimentary form of gunpowder weapon, even preceding the black powder formula. The Byzantines utilized stone, clay, and glass pots, loaded with Greek fire, a flammable substance. Grenades appeared in 11th century China, and would spread to Europe with the Mongol hordes. Here's an image of the Khan's forces using a grenade against the Japanese samurai. It would not take long for European forces to adopt this terrifying armament, and by the 16th century it had become a mainstay in siege and naval warfare. Much like in the modern battlefield, they were an excellent weapon for clearing out entrenched enemies, like those inside of a castle or ship. Grenades became part and parcel of maritime tactics, being used at throwing range to disperse and kill enemy crew and incinerate sails and rigging. In the 17th century, grenades of various sorts became standard equipment for buccaneers and pirates. Explosive and incendiary weapons existed in a vast cookbook of absurd contraptions, ranging from industrial to homemade. Kids, do not try this at home. Most well known would be the iconic iron bomb, so often seen in kids' cartoons. This was a real weapon, known by a multitude of names including stormpot, grenade, grenado, and grenado shell. The name derives from the pomegranate, a fruit which it resembles. In purpose, this weapon and its derivatives was similar to a modern fragmentation or frag grenade, to explode and send out a cloud of sharp, scattering projectiles. If the shockwave doesn't kill you, you're still susceptible to the fragmentary projectiles. These would either come in the form of shards from the shattered shell, or the objects loaded inside of it. The typical grenado was a cast iron shell, between 8 to 10 centimeters in diameter, and weighing around 2 pounds. It might be forged into a single unit, or 2 separate shells merged into one. They were filled with 4 or 5 ounces of powder, and if the producer wanted to do extra damage, they would add projectiles. Bullets and iron nails seem to have been the most common. A fuse hole was drilled in the center of the shell, through which was fitted the fuse plug, a wooden tube. Its conical shape gave it a tight fit. It was hollow and filled with the fuse, sometimes a rope match, together with a substance of sulfur, saltpeter, and mealed powder, made to burn quickly. The fuse plug was then covered with linen and canvas, and fixed with sealing wax. This protected it from the elements, but grenades were often susceptible to moisture and ruined. To use the grenade, the cover was first removed, revealing the fuse. A burning slow match, a piece of rope also used in matchlock muskets, was used to light the fuse. The grenade was thrown, and hopefully, or not, exploded. These grenades were virtually identical to the larger bomb, the name used for the projectiles loaded into mortars, a siege weapon. They were much too heavy to throw by hand, but could be used without mortars. During the siege of Candia, the Venetian defenders rolled down the bombs from sloping planks into the Ottoman trenches. Small bit of trolling. They could also be buried underground and lit with a long fuse, like a landmine. Another variant of the regular grenado was the quarter shell. It was a much smaller grenade, designed to fit into loopholes in fortified positions, like those inside of a castle or the closed quarters of a ship. The basic grenado could be made from other materials than iron. Glass ones were virtually identical, but had a layer of padding to prevent them from breaking on impact. This coating consisted of pitch and cloth. Their fragmentation might be even more terrifying than the iron shell to a body, but would have less penetrating power. More common than purpose-made glass grenados was to take a bottle, fill it with bullets, junk, and a propellant like gunpowder or some other flammable substance. The best bottle for this purpose were case bottles. Used for holding gin, they were square-shaped, allowing for easier shipment. These bottle grenades were known as powder flasks. Blackbeard used them in his final engagement at Ocracoke. And pirates could also follow gunners' recipes, containing instructions on how to make grenades out of paper. These consisted of a homemade shell, made out of paper mache dipped in boiling pitch, and filled with gunpowder and split musket balls. They had the same wooden fuse as the iron grenade. Most rudimentary was the fire bag. This was a simple canvas bag, filled with powder and bullets, and looped around with a rope. The rope was used to throw the bag like a sling. The slinging technique may also have been used on regular grenados. You would never want to be anywhere close to a lit grenado, but there is a chance that the grenade was damaged and wouldn't explode. There is also a chance that you might survive even if it exploded. I've seen modern footage of a frag grenade exploding right in front of an Israeli serviceman in Gaza. I'm not going to show it on YouTube. It's included in the Patreon version of the video. Shout out to the Patreon members. In the video, the soldier is knocked back, but survives. However, such a knockback can of course lead to you breaking something, or knocking you out. The shockwave can also produce internal bleedings, and the powder can burn and blind. The soldier is soon found bleeding in the leg, caused by one of the fragments. Basically, there is a chance that the explosion might not kill you, or that the fragmentation misses you entirely. It explodes randomly, after all. Similar accounts exist in the period. William Snellgrave recounted how he and his men, when boarded by pirates, took cover in the steerage. First the pirates fired their guns into the compartment, and next, he writes the following. They likewise threw several grenado shells, which burst amongst us, so that 'tis a great wonder several of us were not killed by them, or by their shot. Snellgrave and his men might have avoided certain death due to luck, or perhaps due to damaged or poorly made grenados. Or Snellgrave made up the incident. He wrote it several years after it occurred, and his account is a bit too colorful in some cases. But reality tends to be weirder than fiction. Another grenade survival incident was documented by Donald McBain, a Scottish soldier. McBain and his comrades were assaulting a fortress when the grenadier next to him fell dead. He writes, I took up one of them with the sign to throw it amongst the enemy, but it prevented me and broke up in my hands, and killed several about me and blew me over the palisades, burnt my clothes about me so that the skin came off me. I and my gold fell among Murray's company of grenadiers. I was dead like an old dead horse from head to foot. They cast me into water to put out the fire about me. Again, the account does sound a bit fantastical. The man holding the exploding grenade not dying, just being blown off the wall, but people around him falling like flies. Much like the previous one, the story was recounted 1 or 2 decades after it occurred. Grenade accidents were usually fatal. In 1710, privateer Captain Charles Gandy was killed during a fight with French privateers, when one of his own grenades burst in his hand. Modern tests have also been conducted with recreated black powder granados. This one from the channel Ordnance Lab compares it to a modern frag grenade. The granado was able to score 1 hit with the fragmentation, whereas the modern grenade scored at least 3 hits. Both of these tests were conducted at a very close distance, and as we can see, the modern grenade isn't a huge improvement over the pirate one. The results of this video are largely corroborated by tests conducted using recreated granados from the shipwreck of La Belle. This study also measured the damage caused by the shockwave. It says that the pressure was deadly for standing victims within 2 meters of the blast radius, but were essentially safe outside of this distance. Survivability decreases by being close to a reflecting surface, like a wall, deck, or bulkhead. The pressure would bounce off them, and the grenades of the test would have been especially deadly indoors. Much like the previous test, this one showed that the risk of getting hit by fragmentation was low. The clay pots which the grenades were kept in produced more and smaller fragmentations. Clay pots were a whole different animal. Known as fireballs or firepots, they could appear in a multitude of designs. Some were simple clay balls, with multiple holes to provide oxygen for the flammable materials. Others looked like cute little baskets, bizarrely weaved with a sailor's knotwork, and a braided handle for throwing it. The most common kind looked like something you'd keep preserves in, but they contained a far more horrible mixture than Grandma's applesauce. On their side they had these cute little ears, to which was attached a pair of slow matches. If the pot didn't break, the fuse would blow it up like a regular granado. But if it shattered on impact, the slow matches would immediately ignite the powder. Since the powder wasn't trapped, it would burn instead, and possibly start a fire aboard the ship. Hence the name, Firepot. The flames could set men alight, a terrifying prospect, or even ignite boxes of cannon and musket cartridges, creating a lethal chain reaction of explosions and mayhem. Some of these pots were filled with a different preserve than the one inside of their iron cousins. Regular gunpowder was mixed with additional saltpeter and sulfur, ammonia, camphor, pitch, and linseed oil. This substance was made to burn more effectively. A few firepots, including those found aboard La Belle, contained a small iron granado inside of it. The wooden fuse plug of the pot was pierced for a twine fuse connected to the granado. The clay shell would provide additional fragmentation. The most terrifying firepots were much larger and were filled with several iron grenades. So when the pot shattered, the slow match would ignite the spilled powder, which in turn would ignite the grenades. These might spread across the enemy deck before exploding in a violent series of fireworks. If the pot somehow didn't shatter on impact, the explosion would be even more powerful, or even spread the grenades everywhere. A similar weapon was the sausage, used by Spanish sailors when defending the Honduras ship against a buccaneer assault. They were pipes made of tarred cloth, filled with powder and rolled up into sausage shapes around 2 inches in diameter. These devices were normally used as large fuses to ignite mines on the siege fortifications, but could also be used as an improvised incendiary. The fire wheel was an unconventional and seemingly uncommon contraption. Dusted gunpowder was combined with charcoal, tar, saltpeter, and rosin, the resin from pine trees. This substance was gently heated, and tow or flax dipped in it and wrapped around a hoop. A final dusting of powder was added to it, and the wheels dried. When ready to be used, they were set alight and thrown down upon the enemy from the masts. These burning, spinning contraptions must have been a terrifying sight, and would have been dangerous to the sails and rigging. A wise enough gunner would know how to make special, highly flammable substances. One manual describes a mixture of gunpowder, rough saltpeter, grounded saltpeter, sulfur, rosin, turpentine, verdigris, polyarmonic, bay salt, colophonium, and arsenic. This composition would burn in a blue and greenish color, and might be excellent for terror tactics, which pirates were very fond of. Another composition, consisting of white frankincense, gum sandrake, quicklime, brimstone, camphor, gunpowder, rosin and saltpeter, was able to burn upon the water. Another mixture, containing different oils and quicksilver, could burn under the water. Perfect if you wanted to fight mermaids. These different mixtures could be put inside the firepots or in canvas bags. These bags were often secured to an arrow or javelin, set alight and thrown. These were called fire arrows or fire darts. There were essentially three categories of explosive weapons: fragmentation, incendiary, and stink. The last category was confined to the stinkball or stinkpot, a weapon whose purpose was akin to a modern flashbang, but might best be likened to tear gas. There were many ways in which to produce a stinkpot. One recipe lists gunpowder, pitch or tar, saltpeter, sulfur, California, mixed together with powdered horse hooves, asafoetida, sagapinum, and spatula foetida. I've no idea what half of these things are. I presume they're disgusting. In reality, you could take whatever putrid materials you might imagine. Shit, piss, cum, period blood. The mixture was then either put inside of a clay pot or dipped cloth in it, wrapped into a ball, dried it, lit with a fuse, and threw it among the enemy. The gas would immediately attack and irritate the eyes and lungs of the enemy, disrupting them and forcing them out of fortified quarters, back into fresh air, and the sights of your muskets. The stinkpot was not a deadly weapon, so the question might be, why use them instead of a grenado or firepot? For one, you might not want to kill, but capture your enemy. And when compared to a grenado, which wasn't always guaranteed to kill the fortified enemy, even when used in clusters, a single stinkpot in a room might be able to disable everyone inside, forcing them to surrender, or allowing you to cut them down. This would be many times more effective. It was just a ball of paper and shit, whereas grenados were pricey bits of iron, powder, nails, and fuse. One was definitely cheaper and easier to produce. So the stinkpot appears quite often in descriptions of pirate equipment. In the armed forces of the period, special soldiers were designated as grenadiers. They were large and strong men, proficient in melee combat and throwing grenades. Their equipment included axes, muskets with slings, so that the musket could be put aside when throwing the grenade, and special pouches for carrying the grenades. It seems that 3 grenades was the standard load inside of these pouches, and this corresponds with various observer accounts of pirates. To light a grenade, the grenadier needed a slow match. This was a piece of rope treated with flammable materials to make it burn at a steady but slow rate, hence the name. They were nominally used in matchlock muskets, but also for lighting the grenade fuses. A pirate might keep his slow match tied around his wrist, and this image from around 1700 shows French privateer Jean Bart with a match between his teeth. As you can see, the match is lit on both ends, which was standard practice. Keep in mind that the match burns very hotly, and keeping it so close to your face might have been uncomfortable or outright dangerous. According to one legend, Blackbeard kept slow matches in his hat, hanging down over his face to create a flaming, smoking, terrifying appearance. Some believe the legend to be just that, and a good way to singe your facial hair, turning Blackbeard into just black. The slow match burns very hotly, and it was safer to keep them inside of a special match case. This was a brass tube attached to the grenadier's belt. It was drilled with holes to provide the match with oxygen. Grenades were a close-range weapon, since they had to be thrown. At sea, the best tactic was to give the grenadiers high ground. This could be found in the tops, the wooden platforms placed midway up the masts. These could also be used by sharpshooters. The tops were covered with a red cloth to provide concealment, and the topmen supplied with multiple muskets, powder and shot, grenades, and even stones to just lob at the enemy like cavemen. The throwing projectiles would be kept inside of troughs. Topmen throwing grenades at exposed enemy crew was a deadly tactic. The incendiary weapons were used in setting fire to the decks and rigging, often having a devastating effect. If it didn't kill the exposed crew, it could force them below deck, or even make them jump overboard. Fires and explosions were terrifying, demoralizing, and having to put out fires would distract the crew from otherwise fighting and expose them to enemy fire. The most notable pirate use of fireworks was by Captain Thompson in 1719, when he managed to use volleys of powder flasks, grenados and stinkpots to defeat 2 pirate hunters that came after him. It was one of the bloodiest pirate victories of the late Golden Age. In land engagements, grenades were used in close quarters, for attacking trenches, fortifications and buildings. Though the smoke grenade hadn't been invented, black powder produces a lot more smoke than modern powder, so a regular grenade could be used to provide the cover necessary to launch an assault, or even escape. In regular attacks, grenades were thrown into buildings, trenches, rooms and over walls. It is straightforward, just don't drop them on your toes. If the pirates wanted to press into a fortified position, think a barricaded door or a gate, they could use a contemporary device called a petard. The name derives from the French word for farting. It is a kind of directed explosive. It consists of a brass or copper barrel, 7 inches deep and 5 inches broad at the mouth, filled with finely grained powder. The petard either had handles forged into it, or was carried with the use of ropes. The fuse was located at the top or end of the weapon. The mouth was then covered with a plank, which was placed against the desired structure, usually a gate or door, and fixed to it. When the weapon was lit, the directed explosion would break the door, or create a breach for the boys to enter. Grenades were primarily an offensive weapon, but there existed a number of defensive explosive devices. Traps. Pirates operated offensively, whereas traps were typically deployed by merchants looking to defend their vessels, especially since a lot of them were improvised and cost-effective. But a few traps were also used by men of war looking to deter boarders. These could be more advanced. In the 1690s, experiments were made on certain man-of-war frigates for spring-loaded explosive devices that could be fired from below to clear the upper deck in case of boarding. But for the most part, defensive traps would have been more rudimentary. Some were as simple as spiked boards to step on, or dried peas strewn about the deck for the attackers to slip on, straight out of Home Alone. Caltrops could also be used in some cases. Carcasses were barrels or big jars filled with gunpowder, sometimes as much as 10 pounds, and connected with a fuse. These were hung up in the masts and rigging of the defending ship. It was best to hang them at the extremities, the ends of the bowsprit and yardarm. When the enemy ship got too close, the opposing rigs would get entangled. The powder jars would fall down upon their deck, and the matches would ignite the powder, starting a fire or burning the men around it. If you were crazy enough, you could even put the jars above the deck of your own ship, in case you were certain that the enemy was coming aboard. The carcasses could be countered by shooting them with muskets and swivel guns. Clay jars were likely to break, barrels would have been more difficult. The powder chest was a long, triangular case, custom made by the ship's gunner, and filled with an inner propellant of powder, followed by random projectiles. Manuals recommended pebble stones, nails, and stubs of old iron. The chest was then nailed to the deck of the ship. You ignited the powder charge from below via a hole the size of a pistol muzzle. And these devices were incredibly cost-effective, since all of the ingredients could be found aboard any ship. A similar device was the caisson. It was a chest filled with several grenades, and sometimes pure gunpowder. More often used on land, it was typically buried and activated by firing a powder train connected to it from some distance. A powder train is just a trail of gunpowder poured directly from its container. The biggest drawback with the grenade was that, even for a burly grenadier, the distance at which you could throw it was limited, seldom farther than 10 or 12 meters. The solution was a variety of what were essentially grenade launchers, firearms designed to shoot grenades. The oldest and most popular kind was the hand mortar. It existed in 3 basic forms. The first kind was a purpose-built weapon, sort of resembling a blunderbuss and dating back to the 1500s. Initially supplied with wheelocks, they came to use the flintlock in later periods. Some of them had a regular-shaped barrel containing the powder charge, terminating in a much larger cup into which you'd put a grenade. To use the hand mortar, you first primed the pan, and next you poured the powder charge into the barrel. When you were ready to fire, you put the grenade into the muzzle and lit the fuse of it. Usage of the hand mortar was often a 2-man operation. The gun was then fired. Now, misfires were common with flintlocks, and if the hand mortar misfired, it was thrown as far as possible, and the 2 men using it ducked for cover. Some of them even had a rope attached to them, so that you could pull the weapon back after throwing it, hoping it wouldn't be broken. A smaller kind of hand mortar was used in firing signal flares. They were used for the same tactical purposes as modern signals, but maybe some silly pirate used the flare to ignite an enemy ship or something. The next 2 types of hand mortars were attachments to muskets. These appear to have been an English invention, with the earliest one dated to the second half of the 17th century. From the Tower of London, they would spread to the colonies. In 1694, 10 of them were sent to Maryland. The first kind was a long cup, ending in a smaller tube, a socket. The socket was fitted over the muzzle of a musket and turned, securing its lock against the foresight of the musket. It resembles a modern muzzle attachment, some of which can also be used to fire grenades. Very tactical. This hand mortar was operated by a 2-man team. The musket had already been loaded and primed, and 1 man steadied the butt of the musket against the ground, holding the gun at the desired angle of fire. The second man placed the grenade in the cup and lit the fuse. The guy holding the musket then pulled the trigger. I imagine he did so with his thumb, otherwise the recoil might have broken his hand. The types of muskets used with this attachment had a shorter barrel than regular muskets. The weirdest type of hand mortar was a butt attachment, built into the musket itself. Instead of having a wooden butt, it had a metal cup of the previous hand mortar, protected by a hinged cover. The cup was furnished with a touch hole and a pan with a sliding cover. The musket was also furnished with a rest, folded into the underside of the forestock. To use this contraption, the rest was folded out at the desired angle and steadied against the ground. The cup was then filled with the main charge and the pan primed. The grenade was then inserted, the fuse lit, and the primer in the pan ignited with a match. Really one of the weirdest weapons of the period, but the chance of misfire was definitely lower than the other hand mortars. They didn't have RPGs in the 17th century, neither role-playing games or rocket-propelled grenades, but they did have fire arrows and fire darts. Now, I talked about them previously, well, the spears with the burning or exploding packages tied to them. The fire arrow had a smaller shaft and was designed to be fired from a gun. The end of the arrow was supplied with grappling hooks to latch onto enemy rigging. It was primarily a weapon for destroying rigging and sails, and one manual described them as a favorite weapon of pirates and privateers. Indeed, another manual described how in hot climates, like the West Indies, the sails would become especially dry and susceptible to catching fire from these terrifying devices. Manuals recommended that fire arrows were shot from crossbows, bows, or longbows. By the end of the 17th century, the crossbow was only really used in sporting and hunting, but maybe some were used for this purpose aboard ships. As for archery, longbowmen were last used militarily in the English Civil War, and the tradition survived privately for the rest of the period. So there was a chance of someone proficient in archery being found aboard a ship. Whether they would be equipped with a longbow is another question. There were also Native Americans found aboard pirate ships, who would have been proficient in the bow and arrow, though they often preferred the musket. Bows were most often found among the native auxiliaries deployed by Spanish forces. They could very often be found defending Spanish cities and fortifications against buccaneer assaults. Exquemelin talked about native archers in his Buccaneers of America, specifically a buccaneer on the Henry Morgan being wounded by an arrow, pulling it out, wrapping it with a length of cotton, and shooting it from his musket. The cotton caught fire and landed in the magazine of the beleaguered castle, causing an explosion which allowed the pirates to take the castle. Much like the previous grenade stories, this one can also be debated. Normally, fire arrows were fired from a special device called the pyrotechnic blunderbuss. Pioneered by the Dutch, they were regarded as a dangerous state secret. In 1653, in a dark room, a covert resolution declared that any ship carrying this blunderbuss and its ammunition, when captured by the enemy, should throw them overboard, lest they fall into the hands of the enemy. They were blunderbusses with a narrow chamber for the powder charge, and a larger barrel for inserting the projectile. It is often believed that the flared muzzle of a blunderbuss was made to spread the shot. It was more likely done to make it easier to load, but for a pyrotechnical blunderbuss, it was probably there to seat the pod-like shape of the fire arrow's combustible charge. Early on they were supplied with matchlocks, but later variants had flinties. They could also be loaded with conventional ammunition, and used like a regular blunderbuss. The pyrotechnic blunderbuss seems to have been very effective, since the Dutch and English, to some degree, used them into the 18th century. The most tactical pyrotechnic blunderbuss came in the shape of a pistol, or pistol carbine. Having an incredibly large bore designed to shoot fire arrows, it could also be used to fire conventional ammunition. The butt of the pistol was extendable into a shoulder stock, turning it into a carbine. Again, very tactical. That brings us to the end of our cookbook of devilish contraptions. Fireworks, explosives, and incendiaries in the age of sail. They included hand-thrown devices like the grenado, firepot, and stinkball, defensive traps like the powder chest and carcass, and fiery contraptions like the fire wheel and fire dart, the latter of whom was shot from a blunderbuss. Some grenades could even be launched out of early grenade launchers, hand mortars. All in all, a dangerous and terrifying family of weapons. Remember to stay safe and do not try this at home. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique, or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below, and if you have any questions you can just send them by email or Discord. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and clicking the notification bell, monetarily by buying some merch, or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free and sponsor-free access to all of my videos.